O Pioneers, Part 2, Neighboring Fields. This is Chapter 2 of Part 2. Emil reached home a little past noon, and when he went into the kitchen, Alexandra was already seated at the head of the long table, having dinner with her men, as she always did unless there were visitors. He slipped into his empty place at his sister's right. The three pretty young Swedish girls who did Alexandra's housework were cutting pies, refilling coffee cups, placing platters of bread and meat and potatoes upon the red tablecloth, and continually getting in each other's way between the table and the stove. To be sure, they always wasted a good deal of time getting in each other's way and giggling at each other's mistakes. But, as Alexandra had pointedly told her sisters-in-law, it was to hear them giggle that she kept three young things in her kitchen, the work she could do herself if it were necessary. These girls, with their long letters from home, their finery, and their love affairs, afforded her a great deal of entertainment, and they were company for her when Emil was away at school. Of the youngest girl, Signe, who has a pretty figure, mottled pink cheeks, and yellow hair, Alexandra is very fond, though she keeps a sharp eye on her. Signe is apt to be skittish at mealtime when the men are about, and to spill the coffee or upset the cream. It is supposed that Nels Jensen, one of the 6 men at the dinner table, is courting Signe, though he has been so careful not to commit himself that no one in the house, least of all Signe, can tell just how far the matter has progressed. Nels watches her glumly as she waits upon the table, and in the evening he sits on a bench behind the stove with his drag harmonica, playing mournful airs and watching her as she goes about her work. When Alexandra asked Signe whether she thought Nels was in earnest, the poor child hid her hands under her apron and murmured, "I don't know, ma'am, but he scolds me about everything, like as if he wanted to have me." At Alexandra's left sat a very old man, barefoot and wearing a long blue blouse, open at the neck. His shaggy head is scarcely whiter than it was 16 years ago, but his little blue eyes have become pale and watery, and his ruddy face is withered, like an apple that has clung all winter to the tree. When Ivar lost his land through mismanagement a dozen years ago, Alexandra took him in, and he has been a member of her household ever since. He is too old to work in the fields, but he hitches and unhitches the work teams and looks after the health of the stock. Sometimes of a winter evening, Alexandra calls him into the sitting room to read the Bible aloud to her, for he still reads very well. He dislikes human habitations, so Alexandra has fitted him up a room in the barn where he is very comfortable, being near the horses and, as he says, further from temptations. No one has ever found out what his temptations are. In cold weather, he sits by the kitchen fire and makes hammocks or mends harness until it is time to go to bed. Then he says his prayers at great length behind the stove, puts on his buffalo skin coat, and goes out to his room in the barn. Alexandra herself has changed very little. Her figure is fuller, and she has more color. She seems sunnier and more vigorous than she did as a young girl, but she still has the calmness and deliberation of manner, the same clear eyes, and she still wears her hair in 2 braids wound round her head. It is so curly that fiery ends escape from the braids and make her head look like one of the big double sunflowers that fringe her vegetable garden. Her face is always tanned in summer, for her sunbonnet is oftener on her arm than on her head, but where her collar falls away from her neck, or where her sleeves are pushed back from her wrist, the skin is of such smoothness and whiteness as none but Swedish women ever possess. Skin with the freshness of the snow itself. Alexandra did not talk much at the table, but she encouraged her men to talk, and she always listened attentively, even when they seemed to be talking foolishly. Today, Barney Flynn, the big red-headed Irishman who had been with Alexandra for 5 years and who was actually her foreman, though he had no such title, was grumbling about the new silo she had put up that spring. It happened to be the first silo on the divide, and Alexandra's neighbors and her men were skeptical about it. To be sure, if the thing don't work, we'll have plenty of feed without it, indeed, Barney conceded. Nels Jensen, Cigna's gloomy suitor, had his word. Lou, he says, he wouldn't have no silo on his place if you'd give it to him. He says the feed oughtn't it. He says the feed outen it gives the stock the bloat. He heard of somebody lost 4 head of horses feeding 'em that stuff. Alexandra looked down the table from one to another. Well, the only way we can find out is to try. Lou and I have different notions about feeding stock, and that's a good thing. It's bad if all the members of a family think alike. They never get anywhere. Lou can learn by my mistakes, and I can learn by his. Isn't that fair, Barney? The Irishman laughed. He had no love for Lou, who was always uppish with him, and who said that Alexandra paid her hands too much. I've not thought but to give the thing an honest try, Mum. 'Twould be only right, after putting so much expense into it. Maybe Emil will come out and have a look at it with me. He pushed back his chair, took his hat from the nail, and marched out with Emil, who, with his university ideas, was supposed to have instigated the silo. The other hands followed them, all except old Ivar. He had been depressed throughout the meal and had paid no attention to the talk of the men, even when they mentioned cornstalk bloat, upon which he was sure to have opinions.